Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, June 21st, and we will hear the presentation, Take Me Out to the Ballgame. We're connecting stadiums to communities. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to answer those. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, type those in the Q&A box, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation during our Q&A period. Today, we are hosted by APA's Urban Design and Preservation Division. Thanks, as always, for joining us. And we appreciate your partnership in bringing today's session. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions for the summer. We have more down the pipeline for August and September. And in fact, we're starting to schedule, I can't believe it, for the fall. So you can register for these and all of our upcoming webcasts at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcasts. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits. You can log those credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number, both of which are on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Again, these are 1.5 AICP CM credits. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, etc. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We record all of our sessions and post them up there. So head over to youtube.com/planningwebcast. We'll pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available for free. So if you subscribe to our channel, you'll get notified when new sessions are available for you to view. So that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have any questions, technical questions or panelist questions, type them in that Q&A box. Don't raise your hand. We don't have sound options for this webinar. We probably will have close to 500 folks on the line from coast to coast. So we're happy to see all of you and welcome. And from there, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Peters, who's going to introduce things and kick us off. So Jim.
All right. Thank you, Christine. My name is Jim Peters. I'm a preservation planner in Chicago. And from 2015 to 2022, I was also APA's ethics officer. But as my jersey indicates, I'm also a baseball fan, and I'm a longtime member of the Ballparks Committee of the Society for American Baseball Research. So I'm very pleased to be a part of today's webinar, which is being sponsored by the American Planning Association's Urban Design and Preservation Division. Briefly, for those unfamiliar with our division, we're a nationwide community of urban design and historic preservation practitioners in the public, nonprofit, educational, and private sectors. Our division helps to promote the importance of design excellence, equitable public realm, and stewardship of our historic places throughout the planning profession and beyond. If you aren't a member, we invite you to join. And with that, now to today's speaker. Janet Marie Smith is the Executive Vice President of Planning and Development for the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team. She's also founder and chair of Canopy Team, a consulting firm with offices in Baltimore, Maryland, and Pasadena, California. Her and Canopy's U.S. projects include baseball parks in, this is quite a list, Atlanta, Baltimore, Boston, Durham, Jacksonville, Los Angeles, Angels and Dodgers, Oakland, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Sarasota, Spartanburg, and Worcester. And in addition to baseball, Canopy has also worked on projects with Chelsea FC at Stamford Bridge, England, and the Paris, France basketball team at Adidas Arena. A native of Jackson, Mississippi, Janet Marie holds a bachelor's degree in architecture from Mississippi State University and a master's in urban planning from City College of New York. In his 2014 book on Chicago's Wrigley Field, a nice little place on the north side, author George Will wrote, "The three most important things that have happened in baseball since the Second World War were Jackie Robinson taking the field for Brooklyn in 1947, free agency arriving in 1975, and Orioles Park at Camden Yards opening in 1992. This last was an act of heroic nostalgia, which is why Major League Baseball owes a debt to a woman from Mississippi. To those who said," George Will writes, "you can't turn back the clock," Janet Marie Smith responded with, "Well, we'll just see about that." And so with that, I'd like to welcome Janet Marie Smith, and many thanks to her for joining us today.
Well, thank you all for having me. I love talking about this, the intersection of cities, urban planning, and baseball is a favorite convergence of loves for me. And while I've worked in sports now for almost 30 years, I still feel like my feet are firmly rooted in my original love, which is cities and urban planning. And so as I thought about putting this together, while I wanted to start with where we are today and the trajectory of our cities and how we think about them and how sports venues fit in, the more I worked on my slides, the more I realized I couldn't tell this story except to start at what feels like the beginning for me. So I hope you'll indulge me as I think a bit about how we got to Oriole Park at Camden Yards. When it opened in 1992 and what that meant in terms of where we are today, some 32 years later. When I first started working in baseball, one of the things that we were trying to think about is how do we take advantage of a selection of a site that was in downtown Baltimore, full of potential to go one way or the other. It could have easily been cleared to be another round park. It could have been Kansas City with bricks, or it could be something that harkened back to the earlier era of the classic ballparks of the 1920s. The then president of the Orioles, Larry Lucchino, passionately wanted the latter. He had grown up in Pittsburgh with Forbes Field as his first love. And so he felt very strongly about trying to think about ballparks such as Ebbets Field and Shibe Parks in Philadelphia, even Fenway in Boston, still alive at the time, though the other two were gone, and what made them special. And it was no accident that looking around the league, when we realized that the two smallest parks in baseball, Wrigley Field and Fenway Park, had consistently the highest attendance, in spite of the fact that at the time, over half of the major league teams were still sharing their venues with football and playing in a large cavernous facility like these. The multi-purpose era that was born in the late 50s and lasted until the early 80s gave us venues like Three Rivers in Pittsburgh, Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati, and Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia, to name a few. Now, these venues all were publicly financed, and I think for the public sector to justify using these buildings as a tool for redevelopment, they inherently looked at how many things could be accomplished, how could we take care of both our baseball and football team at once. And I'm not going to get into the whole business of how that happened, but I do think it's really interesting and instructive for those of you who know baseball and are interested in the story. When the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants were reborn from their New York venues to the West Coast, they took with them this realization that the city needed to try to think of how it could be an avenue for financing these buildings and keeping teams rooted where they were, and that too became a bit of a policy game changer. It wasn't, of course, all about the architecture and urban planning or lack thereof. I mean, I think we all look at that era with some almost bemusement of how it was used as a tool to literally clear areas and build something that, while often was urban in its location, was very anti-urban in terms of its behavior. As cities really reinvented themselves and started to think about what their future was going to be like as industry moved out, and particularly many cities that had waterfronts were losing the traditional source of revenue and rationale for why they had been built on the water anyway. Baltimore, as I learned when I was in planning school at City College in New York, had reinvented itself and had really not waited to be reactionary to what do we do now that we've lost that industry and our peers are decaying, and the very thing that defined the city's economy, not just its geography, but its economy up until the 70s was gone. And containerization of the shipping industry just totally rendered ports this size ineffective and useless for industry. But the city of Baltimore, perhaps, as I learned in school, because of its proximity and knowledge of federal policies and monies that were available in Washington, a mere 30 miles down the road, totally reinvented itself and was one of the first cities to move things like the convention center into the urban center. There was a national aquarium, a science center, a waterfront promenade, the Jim Rouse Festival Marketplace pavilions, a light rail, all these things that were considered building blocks for a new way of thinking about downtown long before the term urban entertainment center had been coined, or we started to see live, work, play signs everywhere. And what was interesting to me about the Orioles is that they played, like many teams, in a multi-purpose venue, perhaps a lot less daunting than the three I showed, but still a multi-purpose venue they shared with football. The football team had moved to Indianapolis. That's a story for another day, but it's still top of mind for anyone who lives in Baltimore, that the Colts left and left a hole in the collective heart of the city. And the state and city were simply not going to allow their other team to get away. Remember, their basketball team had also left and gone to Washington. So the Orioles accepted a promise from the state to build downtown on a site known as Camden Yards. It's an old rail site. And Larry Lucchino, the then president of the Orioles, used the Kansas City model. Though it was somewhat suburban in its location, the fact that Kansas City had built a baseball park and a football stadium on the same parcel of land with shared parking gave an opportunity to convince the state legislature in Maryland that it made sense to separate these venues, and that the 90+ acres that they had set aside in downtown Baltimore was sufficient to house both teams. And by the way, we didn't have a football team at the time. It was still an aspiration, still a dream. So the site of Camden Yards was given over to the state of Maryland to create a baseball home for the Orioles. And the Orioles given a seat at the table to work with RTKL as the planners and HOK Sport as the architects, now known as Populous, to create what we know today as Orioles Park at Camden Yards. There was a lot of discussion about how to take Larry's fondness and passion for these old-fashioned ballparks and create something that felt truly urban in nature. And much thought and care was given to the first question that this photograph might point to, which is, what about that warehouse on the site? If any of you have been following along for any length of time, you might know that the warehouse itself, 1,000 feet long and only 50 feet wide and built over the course of 40 years, was considered very controversial. There were many who thought it should be torn down so that the ballpark would have room to breathe. There were many who thought it should be torn down because it was, quote, just a warehouse. But we felt in looking at the early versions of baseball in cities, the Ebbets, the Shives, the Wrigleys, the Fenways, Tiger Stadium. Those parks really used their context to create the very things that gave them identity. So tearing out the context seemed to be antithetical to the goal of designing to context. Seems pretty obvious today, but that wasn't the course of the thinking. I love Jim's introduction of himself as a preservation planner. I think I might see what you have to do to co-opt that title, because I like that idea too. We fought very hard to save the warehouse. Our logic was that we could put things like Usher's changing room, central kitchen, offices in the warehouse. It was cheaper than building it in the new structure in the ballpark. HOK did a lot of work to prove that in order for the state to feel comfortable with the recommendation. And then we worked equally hard on the whole scale question of Camden Yards, designing it so that the playing field is depressed 16 feet, so that it's almost an optical illusion how a ballpark that is 110 feet from the playing field to the last row of the seats in the upper deck would feel like a scale that was complementary to the 2- and 3-story row homes of adjacent Ridgely Delight. But that was accomplished by HOK setting the upper deck back. We used steel trusses that we worked really hard with our structural engineer, Bliss and Nitrate, to design in a fashion that felt light, airy, architecturally beautiful without any cladding. Again, something that we borrowed as a learning lesson from the older ballparks, and designed the masonry so it was only 55 feet high. And I do want to talk just about the building materials for a moment. Brick and steel defined the early ballparks of the 1900s. It had gone out of favor with the big concrete multi-purpose venues of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even early 80s. And so getting this back was a fight, but one that we really felt was important to the architectural quality of the building, and to take the scale that RTKL had advocated and really make it real. And it's a reminder that you can't divorce scale and orientation from building materials and their sense of doing the job you wanted, the masonry being sort of a heavier defining piece of this 55-foot facade, and the steel sort of intentionally disappearing behind it. The ballpark itself really chose to use the city as a stage set. The best practices in baseball are to have your third baseline due north, but it meant for the Orioles that we had the most number of our fans, some 60 to 65%, were going to be entering the outfield, exactly the opposite of the traditional entree to a ballpark. Back then in particular, and frankly, some things haven't totally changed, entering the home plate entry was considered sort of the pinnacle of the arrival experience. And so our challenge was, how do we make arriving in the outfield seem as though it's the kind of moment that makes your heart flutter, that gives you emotion, you feel like you're already there, never mind that in reality, you still have to walk another 500 feet. But orienting the ballpark this way meant that the city was really a backdrop for the game. And so as we designed this, we thought really carefully about not only the field orientation, the asymmetry of the playing field, the scoreboard in the field of play, the positioning of the bullpens, so you could see who was warming up from any seat in the house. But how did we design the scoreboard so that the scoreboard, the batter's eye, the warehouse were this mid-ground that helped build a beautiful postcard composition for the ballpark, so that the city of Baltimore would forever be sort of intertwined in the psychic of any baseball fan. We really appreciated that we were able to bring in David Ashton as the graphic design team to work with us on the scoreboard, give it character, not just in terms of making it beautiful, but giving it meaning, so that we were able, with every move, to create a moment that brought excitement to our fans. This idea that RTKL had developed, led by David Murphy, where you entered either end of Utah Street and the turnstiles were put out on a day of game so that you had energy on the street and it was inside the ballpark. But on a non-game day, the turnstiles went away and the street you see in the foreground, as well as the uses in the warehouse, were an everyday thing that contributed to the energy and excitement of downtown Baltimore. The scoreboard itself had the H and the E of our sponsor, the newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, set up so that it would denote a hit or an error. The wind vanes were designed so that they worked as wind vanes. And you might ask, well, if they work, why is one bird the opposite of the other? It's because the wind would hit off of the warehouse and create this little eddy over Utah Street. For those who are really kind of into what the airflow does to the game, that was kind of a thing. And as you can see, when it opened, the letters of the clock spelled out Baltimore Sun rather than the numerals 1 through 12. The B's that flank it are from our 1890s logo, which also appears on the end standard. My point is, everything mattered. And that was much of our thinking, is that as we worked with the design team and creating something that felt very urban, felt very timeless, we wanted everyone from our urban planners to our graphic designers to help us think of how to tell the story of baseball in a way that whether you were a rabid fan that already knew who was pitching and you planned on keeping score, or whether you were just brought along because it was a pretty summer afternoon and a cold beer seemed like a good idea, this was the place we wanted you to be. People often ask some 30 years later, what is it about Camden Yards that we are most proud of, having worked on this for in its inaugural years? And I would say it's the following. It's that since Camden Yards opened, there have been a total of 20 teams that have moved into their urban environment and created something that felt it was one with the city, whether it was the Rockies moving into Lodo and developing Coors Field, whether it was the Giants and their pursuit of what's now known as Orioles Park and its development of Mission Bay, adjacent to it, a $3 billion development that's really changed the landscape of China Basin in the city of San Francisco, our PNC Park in Pittsburgh, which has worked with with the Steelers to develop the area that used to be Three Rivers between their two venues. So the notion that baseball belongs in cities is sort of back again. And while it's been 30-something years, I realize it's a full generation, and the story is still feels very relevant to me when we think about the current state of affairs in baseball and in sports and its relationship with our cities. I feel I'd be remiss not to note that this energy that went into creating a new paradigm for ballparks and their urbanity, not something we set out to do. I always appreciated that Larry Lucchino said, we didn't go out to change the world. We went out to build the best ballpark for Baltimore. But it gave rise to a rethink of both Fenway and Wrigley, by then the oldest parks still operable in the major leagues. And Fenway Park was given a new lease on life. And we had a chance to work on this project, looking at this 33,000 seat venue against the backdrop of every other club having close to 45, 50,000 seats, rethinking that. How did we take the buildings that were appended to Fenway and script them into the functions that make a ballpark special today, which aren't just about the seating, scoreboards, and traditional concessions, but it's about player development facilities. It's about the kind of kitchens, back of house that you need for the media, for the kind of concessions, the retail, the concourse space that we expect. I often say that Camden Yards was like art imitating life, looking at Fenway and trying to figure out how to mimic its key facilities. And if that's true, then the renovation of Fenway Park was like art imitating life. Did I say that right? Life imitating art, art imitating life. And we took a page out of what we've done in Baltimore and said, well, look, Yawkey Way, currently known as Jersey Street, is already closed to vehicular traffic. We went to the neighborhood and to the city and said, may we put turnstiles on the city street? And we went across the street and we worked a deal out with our neighbors, who, by the way, were in the retail business, and made them our inside the park retail operators. Not a strategy that once upon a time the neighborhood or the city of Boston might have embraced. But when they realized that adding space like this was the key to unlocking the future and the potential to keep Fenway Park as the oldest living ballpark in the major leagues, it changed their thinking about privatizing what otherwise is a public street. Similarly, we went to the other side of the park adjacent to bleachers, and we literally moved media trucks, dumpsters, back of house functions out of this area, took a garage that you see on the right that the Red Sox owned and were using it for parking, cleared out a bay of that, and rebuilt concessions and restrooms meeting current standards in a building that was probably built in the early 1900s also. So optically, it feels like an extension of Fenway Park, but you're not looking at an extension of Fenway Park here. You're looking at Fenway Park on the left and the Fenway Garage, a totally separate structure that up until a few decades ago was not even owned by the Red Sox. So in many respects, though people talk about the renovation of Fenway, the renovation of Fenway is truly an expansion of Fenway into adjacent properties that the Red Sox were able to acquire, and the city's willingness to allow us to not only use Yawkey Way, now known as Jersey Street, as an inside the park concourse, but to lease air rights over Lansdowne Street to create the Green Monster seats. When we opened, we thought, golly, how do we make certain it's not just another outfield seat? The answer was drink rails and bar stools. It introduced a new into what was otherwise pretty much suites, stadium chair, and standing room, so that we started thinking about our seating and the fan experience very differently. Same idea on the right field roof. We took an area that once upon a time was used solely for TV cameras and turned it into a place for our fans. What I've loved about the last chapter of ballparks is that in recent years, teams have been given not just the opportunity, but the obligation when they move into an urban environment to ensure that development happens around them. The best example of this, in my opinion, is in San Diego, where the Padres were given not only the right to develop Petco Park and the Gaslamp District, a mere 2 blocks away from the historic area, but they were also given the responsibility within 2 years of the ribbon cutting on this building to deliver hotel rooms, residential units, and office space. Perhaps something we wouldn't ask of a team today, but still the mix of uses. And today, if you go to downtown San Diego, one of the things I admire about the way the Padres have done this is that it's so seamless that you just view it as a cool, bright new neighborhood. You don't think of it as something that's Padres branded. It's intentionally intended to feel like an extension of the city. And part of my admiration for the success is that people laughed at the time that this was on the drawing boards and said, who's going to live in downtown San Diego when you can live at the beach? But today it's considered one of the best in-town urban neighborhoods in America. We've watched the Braves move out of downtown Atlanta and into a county provided parcel and develop something that feels urban. It's not really, but it has an urban feeling to it. But it's evidence, I think, of the Braves' admiration for those cities who do have the real thing, which allows me to end on another one of my favorite projects, one that our Canopy CEO, Fran Weld, oversaw for the San Francisco Giants, Mission Rock, adjacent Oracle Park, which is one of the most aggressive and I think successful urban developments in the country, having just completed their first phase of work with a real emphasis and focus on sustainability, on the relationship to Oracle Park, and on an opportunity to take this vast piece of waterfront in San Francisco and really tie not just the ballpark, but the extension of the city to the waterfront. So with that, I'm going to stop my slides, and I think we've got some questions that I've been fed in advance, and some that I hope you'll just simply throw out there to kind of keep things interesting.
All right. Thank you, Janet Marie. Fabulous overview of what you guys have been accomplishing. And I guess I want to start with what you just ended with, which is Atlanta and San Francisco and San Diego. I think you've said in some of your writings that we now have a pendulum swinging on this, where cities formerly used ballparks to spur redevelopment, and now it's moving in the direction of teams taking on that responsibility with private development projects. And I'm thinking Atlanta, which you just mentioned, Boston Red Sox, Chicago Cubs have been doing that in their Northside Wrigleyville area. So 2 questions coming out of that. One, could you expand on this trend and where you see it going? And then I guess the related part is, does this trend also mean that we'll be having a return to more non-downtown ballparks as owners look to suburban sites where new development may be easier? And you mentioned Atlanta Braves, which is 14 miles north of downtown. There's other ballparks where I've been seeing where they take suburban sites. So how do you deal with this, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is that it's almost the inverse. Camden Yards was taking advantage of existing infrastructure that the city had already invested to grow a traditional office environment. And the logic in putting Camden Yards adjacent that was that you already had transit and parking that could host 200,000 people a day. So why not use it during the so-called off hours to support something that was, generally speaking, a weekend and evening activity? And I think the logic was super sound. And even though we might not see evidence of it because it's been so many decades now, when Camden Yards opened, there were vacant surface lots to the north that have seen development that's since filled in, perhaps not with the scripted development that we see in some of these others, but still attractive development nonetheless. I think as cities have moved away from publicly funding these buildings, teams have looked at the intersection of how the development that they might be able to generate could help justify a financing mechanism, so that perhaps the ballpark itself isn't publicly funded, but there's some kind of district and public construct around the whole area that allows a balanced view of how that investment is made. And thus it seems probably right and appropriate for teams to take on the responsibility of doing that development. To your question about going outside of cities, I know my biases for cities will show here, but you simply can't trade what's often the transit infrastructure in an urban center for something else. And while I think we might view differently a renovation of existing buildings, I think there's something about being able to use that transit, even as our definition and thoughts about cities have changed. Our work habits have changed. Our workplace is not the same. Our work hours are not the same, but there's still something about that energy and the infrastructure that supports it that I think is important to sports and sports teams.
Yeah, I mean, we went from everybody driving to these multi-purpose stadiums to a lot of people taking transit. So it's kind of odd to see this trend moving in the other direction, where they're doing new town developments, basically using ballparks as, anyway. we'll see how many do it. I have another question somewhat related to that. Most new ballparks have been more urban in scale, especially in contrast to what you showed in the 60s and 70s. However, there still are a lot of ballparks that are surrounded by parking lots that are really could be any place. And I'm thinking the Chicago White Sox, Kansas City Royals, the Angels, the Dodgers, which you have a great familiarity with, Brewers and others. How can planners and cities address that and improve those situations to make them more compatible with the surrounding areas?
Well, I'll use Dodger Stadium as an example since it's a project I've had the chance to work on and know it most intimately. Dodger Stadium's land is Dodger Stadium is known for being surrounded by parking, and there is no infrastructure around it, as in the form of utilities or transit, something that we do hope to change. But we're not anti-bus, and I do want to make that clear. It's not just about Los Angeles, but as LA's transit system has become more robust, we've been pleased that Metro provides free bus service from both the South Bay and from Union Station to Dodger Stadium. That combined with ride share, walkability, bicycles, scooters has really changed the demand of the traditional vehicle travel at Dodger Stadium. But what I wanted to show you maybe doesn't address your question head on about the opportunity for development. But I do want to make a bit of a pitch about the opportunity to invest in what you have, because I think it's tempting and easy to look at a ballpark that's 50 years old, 60 in the case of Dodger Stadium, and wonder, can you ever make it behave like a new park? But similar to the way we approached Fenway Park, we said to ourselves, well, we're not going to renovate a 1962 building to behave the way it ought to 60 years later. How do we change things? So as you can see in the slide on the right, our basic attitude was, let's develop around it. We don't have traditional concourses because Dodger Stadium is carved into the hillside of Chavez Ravine. You enter at grade on every level. So at every level, we built a new plaza and then connected them with elevators, stairs, escalators, bridges to create this essentially an apron around Dodger Stadium, so that whereas in 1962 you would have driven your personal car to Dodger Stadium, got out of that car and walked an average of 20 minutes to get to your gate. Today you can get, if you get dropped off where I'm sitting in this photo, you buy one of the free Metro buses, or if you've chosen to bring your car, you get dropped off in what our president and CEO Stan Kasten likes to refer to as the new front door. This 2.5-acre plaza in the outfield of Dodger Stadium allowed us to change the behavior of Dodger Stadium from where you were required to essentially stay in your ticket zone and allow you to move 360 around the ballpark. It changed the average time from when you arrived on the property to when you got into the ballpark to 20 minutes down to about 10 minutes. And it gives you a lot more to do, as you might be able to see in these slides. There's new food and beverage, there are kids areas, there's retail, there's an opportunity to watch the game and watch batting practice from field level by walking underneath the area. You're greeted by bronze sculptures by the artist Bradley Cadet of Sandy Koufax and Jackie Robinson. You can see literally the playing field as you walk in. You can see batting practice happening behind you. And the way we dealt with the batter's eye is that after batting practice, we close the outfield gates, we drop these dark garage doors that act as the batter's eye, and now it's just a kids area on the turf and the game goes on the field. This gives you an idea of what it's like to walk into Dodger Stadium today, where you see this outfield and the team taking batting practice as you enter the gates. There are areas like this, like the beer garden, the memorabilia that we put out from the Dodgers archives that really changes the nature of how this behaves and allows us to take some of our, quote, cheap tickets, of which we have many, a building that's 56,000 seats when most teams are building in the 30s today. We really relish the fact that we're able to invite families, kids of all ages, and really burnish this idea of people coming totally as a family or a group to Dodger Stadium and thinking of it as more than just a baseball game, but a whole outing at the ballpark. Some of this memorabilia that we put out is something that I'll save to talk about in a few minutes, because I think you've got another question about that will prompt me to carry on momentarily.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you if there are lessons from your ballpark work that can apply to other sports venues, soccer stadiums, football stadiums. There were a lot of soccer stadiums being built, basketball, hockey arenas. Are there lessons from what you've been doing on the ballparks that apply to that?
Absolutely. Well, I think that as the hospitality of sports venues has become more and more a part of the formula that drives the game day revenue, it's given teams an opportunity to think of how does that venue stay active year round. That too is good practice, I think, for cities. Nobody needs a ballpark or a stadium or an arena, no matter how beautiful, to be closed. That doesn't do any good for keeping restaurants, hotel rooms, street activity energetic and alive. So we're big proponents of designing those spaces so that they can work for multiple uses, be used year round. I know it's commonplace to assume, well, of course you can do that with your premium areas, your club levels, your suites. But we're big advocates of doing it for Joe Fan too. There's no reason that that everyone in the venue doesn't have those same kind of opportunities. And so one of the things that we've tried really hard to do is make certain that we think about the year-round activity of those buildings.
Yeah, I noticed here in Chicago, the Chicago Cubs is part of what they've done around there. They've created an open space outside the ballpark, Gallagher Way, which is now open all the time. You know, there's flea markets, there's ice skating, there's Christmas markets there. So that whole notion of expanding, using the ballpark as a place to open up to the public, that's been a great thing there. And what I'm seeing in Dodger Stadium, very different from the last time I went to a game at Dodger Stadium.
Maybe you're due to come back.
Yeah, I went back for a tour a couple winters ago, and it was fabulous. Great tour, off-season tour. So, but I'll come back for a game. Let's turn to minor league ballparks here, because we've been talking mostly major league. In 1988, as you well know, Buffalo's Pilot Park became one of the first ballparks to be built in a downtown, I guess in a half a century. Since then, many minor league towns and cities have copied that idea, in part to help them redevelop downtowns. You've worked on a few minor league ballparks, including Jacksonville, Florida, and Worcester, Mass. How are these experiences different from major league cities and ballparks? And what advice would you have for communities that are looking at ballparks or looking to build, improve, especially given that ownerships may be a lot less well off than major league cities?
Well, and I think importantly too, the cities themselves are just a different financial beat. There's no pretending that the Akrons and the Planos are going to be the same as a Chicago or an Atlanta. And so thinking about the scale of the city and the scale of the venue, as well as development around it. And you do see a lot of teams, including Worcester, using the development around the ballparks to help justify the financial investment of the park itself. What I love about minor league baseball is that it is so casual. The team doesn't control who's on the field and when their guys get called up to the major leagues. So you have to count on the venue itself and the entertainment that you provide being the draw, not just the game. And I think minor league baseball in particular has done a really nice job of engaging the community and creating a lot of different kinds of activities within the ballpark that are important components of a community's central square, if you will. Worcester has given a lot of thought to being able to host simple things like a walk in the park so that it's okay to we invite you to come and get your exercise by a perimeter circuit. There's a kids area that's available for use non-game times. There's a store that's open year round. So there are many things about the minor leagues that don't require scale in order to be good urban projects.
That's an interesting point because the major league ballparks are just massive, just by definition of how many seats, whereas minor league, what we're talking 8,000 seat ballparks.
Yeah, you know, when minor league baseball used to have a requirement of 10,000 seats for AAA, but when Major League Baseball embraced minor league as part of their umbrella, that rule softened, and it's allowed teams like the Woo Sox and Worcester to be able to design polar parks so that it's much more elastic. I think there's about 7,500 fixed seats in Worcester, and then about 2,000, let's call them sort of flex seats. It's a general admission ticket. You can put your blanket on the grass in the berm. You can sit in an Adirondack chair. You can have a ticket in a group area. It's not a traditional stadium seat. And sort of the nice thing about that is that on a Tuesday in May, when there's still school and the ballpark's not full, it doesn't feel empty either.
Yeah, I've been amazed at the minor league parks I've seen of how important those grass picnic areas and berms are. I mean, in some cases, half the fans in the ballpark are out there.
Absolutely. My own theory is that as baseball has kind of forced us to put netting for safety reasons, foul pole to foul pole, it's made that outfield seat all that much more desirable because it's the only place where you might be able to actually catch a souvenir, take that baseball home in your glove.
Yeah. That's interesting as to the impact of the netting. If that indeed is, oh, you're right, unless you're in the 20 years, and you've alluded to this before, 20 years old seems to be a critical time for ballparks, and that bond cycles, leases, maintenance, utilities. Is this a good time? And I know you've worked in Pittsburgh and other places to reconsider ballpark environments is rather than face the fact of somebody wanting to tear it down and start all over?
Yeah, I do. You know, it's a convergence of things, and you said it exactly right. Many teams have a lease anywhere from 15 to 30 years. 20 does seem to be kind of the magic number. And often you find that teams are looking not only to renegotiate their lease, but cities are looking to figure out an investment that's going to be necessary to keep the ballpark or arena or football stadium, whatever it is, alive, well, and lasting another generation. And I feel like that's really important from a sustainability perspective. I think it's rather painful to look at something that's structurally sound and somehow think of it as economically obsolete when there's a way of investing in it to get more out of that. And I've enjoyed the projects that we've been asked to look at, including Orioles Park at Camden Yards, where I went back after 20 years and worked for Peter Angelos to invest in some improvements at Camden Yards that address not only sort of the boring things like expansion joints that have failed and chiller plants that need to be replaced. Yeah, you need to do all of those things. Yes, there's infrastructure opportunity and energy efficient lighting and dramatic lighting and the way that quote infrastructure can make your experience better as a fan. But then there's also just a shift in trends. I mean, we were just talking about the minor leagues and how luxurious it is to be able to have that flexible space. Well, we see major league teams looking for similar kind of experiences. So some of the things that we have looked at these ballparks have been kind of simple investments of kids areas, sculptures that celebrate the memories and the history of those who have been there, the experience that we've been able to add by building a bar on top of the batter's eye, a total sort of rethink of concessions, a redo of the outfield wall and the way the scoreboard was positioned so that more fans can look into the bullpen, more fans had the standing room that you see in the foreground at the top left looking into the game. And in PNC Park, we particularly enjoyed the opportunity to rethink the Riverwalk, long a defining feature of the Pirates' home, but something that in previous iterations was just a pass-through. And today we think of it as a place in and of itself, with bars that have replaced a security station in the outfield, with baseballs that adorn the public side of the Riverwalk that celebrate every Pirate, Gray, Crawford, all the Negro League teams, as well as the Major League team of the Pirates who've gone through Pittsburgh and are now in the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. In Philadelphia, we had a chance to kind of rethink how we presented our entrances so that there's just a level of experience and memory that dots these buildings that are very gentle massages to the architecture, but a very big change to the experience that you can have in these ballparks.
I wish you guys could come to Chicago and help fix our parks. I mean, Chicago Bears are talking about replacing a stadium that was built just 20 years ago, that in 20 years, it no longer fits their needs. And White Sox the same way.
Well, I didn't put this in my slides, but one of my favorite projects ever that I had a chance to work on was the transformation of the Ed Smith Stadium for the Orioles. It was built in 1989 for the Chicago White Sox, and when it got old, they left. And then the Cincinnati Reds were there, and golly, they loved being in Sarasota, but Ed Smith Stadium was too old and boring, this little concrete donut with not much on it. And thanks to the commitment of the county of Sarasota and the good work of David Schwartz, the architect that was brought in to do this, we were able to sort of literally wrap the building with a 50-foot wide skirt, let's call it, a two-story skirt that added suites, added club levels, added shaded seating, and gave us a shaded concourse, as well as just a total new image of what Ed Smith Stadium might look like. And it is just one of my favorite kind of before and after, ugly duckling transform into a swan. I think Gianna's got it pulled up so that I could share it. So, and this is a good example of a building that was just about as boring as a building could be. This was, as I said, built in 1989, and this photo was probably taken in, I don't know, maybe let's call it 2007 or 8. And nobody wanted to be here. It was just nothing but the basics. It was seats, they weren't shaded, a few restrooms, a few concession stands, and perhaps the ugliest press box in all of Major League Baseball. And when we finished, it was this. But what's different is that it's not just a new dressing on this building. It's really a total transformation of the way it behaves. And as I said, the second floor now overlooks the ballpark, provides you with shade over the seats, a shaded concourse, as well as program new retail and concessions into the building. Plus, it is rather beautiful. Kudos to David Schwartz and his team.
Yeah, that's an impressive overhaul. There's a number of minor league or spring training ballparks that I guess have been redone in recent years, as well, with that maybe as the model for what's been done. What we haven't talked about is domed ballparks, and talking about both fixed and retractable, which seems to be a growing trend in cities because they want, there's the weather features. Arlington recently built a new retractable roof. Houston Milwaukee, Phoenix, Seattle. What, if anything, can be done to diminish kind of the overwhelming scale of these parks, many of which are nice designs, but to make them more compatible with surroundings? Do you have any examples? Or
It is a tough question because the sheer act of not just the dome, but the enclosure that supports it ends up not only being an enormous scale, but it inherently creates almost a wall between the building, its interior, and the city around it. And there have been a lot of tricks that have been tried, lowering the playing field so that the overall perception of the building isn't as large. I think some of David Manica's recent work has looked at, instead of making the roof operable, open the windows instead. I think that his Vegas building for the Raiders is a great example of, let's stop with this roof that we know in 15 years is going to have its mechanisms broken and have to be replaced. Let's open the window instead so you have a view of the skyline. And I think there's some things that many architects have started to employ in these buildings that give you the conditioned space where the feeling is that the climate merits that, but still changes the way it operates. And then, of course, there's always the aspiration that there'll be more things around it that help reduce its perceived scale.
You've shown a couple pictures of some of the things that you've done with Dodger Stadium in terms of old seats, historic features and things. Is that a new thing where you found elements of the old ballpark and brought them out?
We call it our fun stuff. I used to try to describe that we were talking about not just interiors, graphics, artwork, and memorabilia, but the composition of those things. At Dodger Stadium, we used to think of it as our rainy day projects. And of course, it never rains in LA, but we still thought of it as our rainy day projects, and would go and kind of empty out our storage bins and put stuff out on display. Even things that our archivists said, let's scan those and get rid of it, would wind up on bookshelves and clubs. And we've enjoyed that story. I think that sort of storytelling is a really important component of buildings and the way we think about buildings today. It gives them kind of a life and a presence that we didn't see before. I showed earlier some of the things that we've done at PNC Park and at Camden Yards, but I think if you will give us a second, we'll pull up a few things from Dodger Stadium. That last slide that I didn't dwell on that had the memorabilia. Well, actually, we can stay here, but like, these are not old signs. These are old graphics that we painted new on Fenway Park. Adding the kids areas, I mentioned earlier, the baseball is devoted to Cy Young Award winners. The old Dodger ticket booths, when we retired those, we painted them and turned them into sculpture. Signage that we found in the outfield that had been cut up and was being used by our maintenance department as miscellaneous metals. We're like, whoops, looks like graphics to us, but sort of the total composition of how these things are put together. Those are original 1962 wooden chairs that we bought from Steve Archer. He had them in a warehouse in New Jersey. He said when we had 32, I said, great, we'll buy 32. And we brought them and we went to Peter O'Malley's office. We color matched them to the original colors of the 1962 seats. So there's a real authenticity to the way this is put together. And I really enjoyed working with some of the local firms that we brought into our projects who are able to help us understand the culture of a place, the artists and the architects who live there. We're so proud of the work that Brenda Levin, known as a preservation architect in Los Angeles, has helped us on Dodger Stadium to create things that have really given meaning to the mid-century modern vocabulary and enhanced it in a way that we never could have on our own. Susan Perrin often helps us with our artwork and sort of the depiction of quotes and jerseys and how we can put together artifacts from the club in a way that allows the building to tell its own story. And I think that's one of the things I've enjoyed most about working within sports is that there are so many great stories to tell, and how can we use these elements to help make you feel like you're in a place that's timeless, and that what might happen this afternoon could end up being part of a display someday in the future.
Yeah, as a preservationist, I love these elements of the past. Last night, I don't know how many people saw it, but there was the major leagues played at Rickwood Field, which is the oldest ballpark in the country, built in 1910. And I was amazed how many, as they're showing the pregame, how much they have incorporated the history of the place and the many players from the Negro Leagues and other baseball that have played there. And
So
that sense of history is so, I think, important and poignant, especially with this.
we're very proud at Canopy that that's one of our projects, that Major League Baseball invited us to come and work with them on Rickwood Field and on the fan facing side of it. And it was so exciting to learn that a total of 182 Major League players who are honored at Cooperstown as being in the National Baseball Hall of Fame have played on that field. And to be able to to do the research, to craft the exhibits, to take the old clubhouses and set up lockers there that were a tribute to those players, particularly the Negro League players, was just a real honor for the members of our firm who got to work on that. Paul Hanlon led that effort for us, and the stories he tells of how emotional it was to be at Rickwood Field, the home of the Birmingham Barons, with Willie Mays' plaque. Willie Mays was from Birmingham, and to have been there when it was announced that he passed away, and just the emotion around having resurrected this building for this series, already having the plaque from Cooperstown there, and just remembering those greats, and in particularly Willie Mays and what he meant, not just to baseball, but what he meant to America, and sort of bridging so many different attitudes about bringing people together was, I think, just one of the values that sports do bring, and one of the reasons that these are viewed as civic buildings. I think we didn't really talk about this, but I think there's a core question of why sports, like why should we as a city care about this as our community? And I do think it's one of the few things that brings us together, that allows us to sort of transcend economic, social backgrounds, that allows us to look at some of the very challenging racial relationships across America and our history, and face those head on, but see how sports can bring us together, and what it means not only for the Negro Leagues and having incorporated those records into Major League Baseball, but even looking at things like the Japanese internment camps and how baseball was used there to help introduce the rest of America to that community, and how it was used to bridge that gap. And there are so many stories that I think sports allow us to tell and allow us to feel. And I think being in a position where we can present that as something that does help us celebrate sort of being together. I mean, what are cities but for a place to bring us together?
It's a great point, and that really came through last night watching Rickwood, is the stories of the civil rights movement and segregation and what players went through. All of that was only able to be told because of the ballpark. It really became the place to tell those stories of what happened. And I thought it was a fabulous, fabulous thing for MLB to go down there and play the game, and the work that you guys did. I think, have we covered most of the questions that we had set up? I mean, are we ready to move to the audience, see what they have? Christine?
Okay. Yeah, we've got a lot of great questions.
Good, good.
Let me, here we go. So I would like to, well, first of all, I guess I'm going to start with me. So I want to tell you guys a story. Okay. So obviously I'm a Guardians fan. Where am I going here? Here we go. Formerly the Cleveland Indians, being here in Cleveland. but I like just kind of going along with what you all were just talking about. So this monument or statue, I guess, um, I just want to tell you guys kind of like how it came to be. So the team's name references the Guardians of Traffic, which are eight um, monolithic sculptures. They're Art Deco, and they were erected in 1932, and they were placed along downtown Cleveland's Hope Memorial Bridge, which is adjacent to the ballpark. And each one of these guardians holds a different ground vehicle, from a hay wagon to a truck, and it symbolizes the evolution of transport and the breadth of their protection and uh, prosperity for Cleveland. So that's what these kind of towers meant. And these towers have just been very iconic to Cleveland's history. Um, and that's why the Guardians are who they are now, or totally because of, you know, these big columns that are on a bridge adjacent to the ballpark. And it just means a lot to Clevelanders. So um, with that, let's get to some questions. The first one that I would love is for you, Janet. What ballpark do you love that isn't even around anymore? Is there one? Is there a historic ballpark that doesn't exist anymore um, that you'll
Yes,
never forget?
I think Ebbets is the ballpark I would most have loved to have seen. And perhaps that's because it's full of so much lore and not just about its architecture. I mean, I touched earlier on the fact that it had this asymmetrical playing field and 297 down the right field line and this outfield wall that kind of kicked in at a 10-degree angle, and it had that great sign, hit here, win a suit. It had low, long roofs, so it looks like it had a lot of shade. I've seen the drawings for their rotunda. Gary Cypress, a collector in Los Angeles, and owner of the LA Sports Museum, has a piece of the stone from the rotunda of Ebbets. So I feel like I've seen so many things that make me wish I knew it as a building. But I'm also just fascinated with the story of the Dodgers leaving Brooklyn and moving to Los Angeles and what that meant and how it symbolized our attitude about a shift from being an East Coast centric nation to one that really thought of ourselves as coast to coast, and what it meant in terms of the way cities thought about themselves, thought about their relationship with their team, the way there are still people in New York who hate the Dodgers because they left, or they love the Dodgers because they were their grandparents' team. And those stories are really interesting to me from a planning perspective. And I guess Ebbets is a symbol of that.
I love that.
I've often asked people that I've known who went there, was it as romantic as it seems? And I have to say, you get a less than 50-50 response. I think by the time you left, it was pretty, it was crowded, it was dark, it was dungy, people weren't going. The last game at Ebbets did not sell out. So there is a romanticism around it that wasn't present when the Dodgers moved, I think.
Hmm,
They love the team, maybe not so much the park. I don't know.
sure. Interesting. Let's talk for a moment about the public's role in a new stadium or reinvigorating a stadium. So, how does the public opinion play into this? Do they? Are there forums that you have participated in where the community has had the opportunity to give their input?
Yeah. Well, I do feel very, very strongly about it. I don't think it's a science. I do think it's more art. I love getting feedback from fans, but sometimes that feedback is just to take off my badge and go sit in the bleachers and have a cold drink myself and listen to the banter around me. There's something about just learning by observation and learning by talking to fans that sometimes feels a little more authentic than a specific forum or data or surveys, because inherently in those, the feedback you get is only as good as the way you phrase the question or the sample pool you've used or the reference points you've used. So I don't discount the methodology of having data-driven surveys, but I think there is more to imagining what things can be than data will tell you. You can't be totally reactionary to things. And I do feel like you need public input on this, no matter the funding. I think that's a question that's often asked because people are like, oh, then it's because we're being asked to, as a community, to underwrite bonds or to provide the infrastructure for a site or to approve a lengthy set of liquor license. But we want the public to enjoy these buildings. I mean, we must, but why are we there? But for giving fans a connection to a team that we hope they love or will learn to love. Even our television revenue is nothing if fans don't love our team. And the experience of going there is part of it. And I hate to keep coming back to baseball but I do love it the most, I think. I think it's so fun that because every baseball park is so different and the outfield configuration is often shaped by the city that it's in and its traditions, that baseball fans, unlike any other sport, make a trek to see every ballpark. And the really hardy work their way through the major leagues, and then they hit Kansas City to go to the Negro League Museum, and they go to Cooperstown to go to the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and then they start in the minor leagues. And I think there's something about that journey that is so special and just fun. And I envy to be one of those people one day myself.
That's great. We touched a little, you and Jim touched a little bit on training facilities, or I'm sorry, like AAA or AA ballparks, things like that. And I'm going to add to that training, spring training facilities. And also someone brought up a really good point about, for example, the Olympics and how Olympics will come into a community, build all these structures, and then sometimes they're never used again. And in 2028, the Olympics are coming to the US, to California, I think.
Yep. Los Angeles.
Yes. And how does all of that play in this sort of like adjacent major league ballpark
Yeah, no, it's a
forum?
great question. I think these big marquee events like the Olympics, World Cup, et cetera, are starting to look differently at this notion of how to use existing venues, which is not just about money, but it's just like, what's the point in doing that? I love that the World Cup, when it comes to the United States, is planning to use existing venues rather than build new ones. And it's exciting. I know this is a really old story, and I don't know, maybe nobody's on this call that'll even have it as a reference point, but in 1984, when the Olympics were held in Los Angeles, existing venues were used throughout, but Sussman Praja, architecture and graphic design firm, was brought in with the Journey Group to design this temporary look of scaffolding and colors and banners that really united the city. And for once, LA had no traffic because the planners scripted out staggering work days for everybody, and the city bought into it. And I think one thing that's fun and interesting about these marquee events is that we get together to make our cities work to host those things. And you wonder, well, what lessons did we learn that we can use every day? Like if that worked and that eradicated traffic patterns and we all got used mass transit for the week and it worked, like why don't we learn to love that as our everyday habit? So I think there's some interesting things that have come and gone and some that are coming back about those projects. Even in Qatar, when they built all these new buildings for the World Cup, they were left with the question of what to do with them. And one of the Canopy had a chance to work with Legends on reprogramming one of those for women's sports in a country that doesn't traditionally look at women the same way we do here in America. We don't, women here in America play and train and work out with men and not so there. So to do something that focused on women was sort of an interesting way of rethinking something that was built single purpose.
Keeping on with the single purpose theme, I know Jim asked you about domed fields. I guess you could say if a ballpark is looking to move downtown or to rebuild downtown, people would say, well, man, you're going to use this huge swath of land for how many games? And coming from someone, for example, who's in Cleveland, we don't have a dome, and our weather is such that we can't really have any other events outside of baseball season at the park. Are there ways, have you seen ways that ballparks have been able to utilize the park outside of just for baseball?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was working with the Red Sox and we were renovating Fenway Park, one of the things that we said, as honestly and openly as we could, because we were living in a residential neighborhood, been there since 1912. We've been there longer than the residents have, but that didn't mean they didn't have something to say about what we were doing. Is that if we're going to be if we're really going to be a good neighbor, and save this park, how do we use it year round? I pick on Boston because you mentioned Cleveland and its weather. Well, Boston isn't, but Boston's got real winters too. But the Red Sox have one of the most aggressive programs in baseball of running something 365 days a year and booking tours, booking events, and booking conventions, having their concourse closed for concerts, having voting there. COVID shots were there. Like there's so many things. They aren't all about just making money. They're about keeping your doors open and using the building. And I think that that's a really smart thing and sort of burnishes the way we want to be thought of in sports as today's version of your civic center. How can we do more things that invite you to use the building? Trick or treating on the concourse. I mean, that was sort of a wonderful way of inviting the public to come into a safe space post COVID. Safe, was thought of in terms of health. I think safe is just maybe we're a little more timid in some cities of the old-fashioned tradition of trick or treat. How can we still keep that alive for kids in a safe environment? So I love seeing teams use buildings for things like that aren't necessarily about whether it's weatherproof or not.
I've noticed a couple ballparks are now doing driving ranges from the upper deck. What do you think about that?
I think it's fun. It's sort of a novelty, and you see, hockey coming in for a quick,
Right.
a quick presentation. You see Top Golf coming in. You see ski slopes coming in for the day. Even performers when they go to a place like Fenway, it's about the novelty of it. There's probably an open air venue better suited to a concert, but it's about the novelty of being there. And I think that sports enjoy being that sort of, hey, I'm here for something different stage.
Yeah, I think Wrigley Field's done a lot of that with concerts and
Yes.
things since the
Yeah.
new ownership.
I love every time I go to Google Earth to pull up Polar Park, home of the Worcester Red Sox AAA club. I laugh because the Google Earth photo was taken when Holy Cross was hosting a football game at the baseball park. So I know I'm looking at a baseball park, but everybody else is like, hey, I see a football field on Google Earth.
That's funny. Next question. It says the Washington Nationals made a point to blend into the environment as well as their urban context, calling it a green ballpark. Are you starting to see more of this? And what environmental practices are compatible with so much activity and hardened surface? Like, is there a lead for ballparks? I guess is what we're saying. And what have you seen? Are there green roof decks,
Yeah,
recycled materials?
I
Like
think
what? Tell
everyone,
us what you
I
know.
think, yeah, I think everyone tries. I mean, so I'm not telling you anything this group doesn't already know. There's always a conundrum with the first cost versus the end cost. And I think there's a lot of effort. And I think what the Nationals did, that's really one of the most dramatic changes is the way the district was able to work with the area around nationals to allow it within a 10-year time frame to totally be transformed into a really vibrant residential neighborhood. And one thing I really like about the way that's grown up is that it is a very legit, real extension of the city. I sometimes get a bit frustrated with the term sports and entertainment district. It's like, how many sports bars can you really do? Whereas you build an authentic extension of the city, as we see in the District of Columbia, or at Petco Park, or at Mission Rock in San Francisco, where people really live there, they really work there. The retail isn't just about one more beer before or after the game. And I think it's a much greater contribution to the city. I thought about that point, though I said it earlier when you mentioned the Nationals, because I do remember when they opened being surrounded by all the auto repair shops, and people thought, golly, is this ever really going to change? And by golly, within 10 years, it did. And yet the district allows a outdoor LED boards and lighting and quote entertainment component that's much more sophisticated and less of a beer or bust mentality than you see in other situations, and I admire that.
I have a quick question. What is the piece of wood behind your head?
This is a good question. I'm sorry that Fran Weld isn't here to answer that herself. Um, Fran oversaw the Mission Rock development for the San Francisco Giants. And while it was largely an industrial piece of property that they were developing, there was one tree right in the way, that one of the development parcels, and Fran worked really hard to work around it. And when it finally seemed as though the development parcel was needed, the tree was used for making furniture, and they made one piece for Fran to have on the wall of our conference room.
Christine, I had one other question that goes back to the very beginning. Your academic degrees were in architecture and urban planning. And after you graduated, you worked for Battery Park City in New York and Pershing Square in LA. How did you get from there to the staff of a baseball team?
Well, Battery Park City will play a bigger role in that than maybe meets the eye. I had a chance to work on that project at 92-acre development in Lower Manhattan that had been kicking around with many false starts for several decades until the early 80s, when Cooper Extott developed a master plan that extended the streets of Lower Manhattan to the waterfront, and the Battery Park City Authority developed a development strategy that said, let's put the infrastructure in first, let's put in the waterfront, the streets, and let's design buildings that are very contextual, that feel like they could be a legitimate extension of Lower Manhattan. And I loved being a part of working as a developer, not as a developer in the traditional sense of the word, but working at sort of the beginning of a project and developing the stage set that architecture could really survive and be its best, and managing the financial and the political front end of things that allows what planners and architects do best to be implemented. And when I mentioned earlier that I had gone to urban design master's program that Jonathan Barnett had at City College. And we had to study a city. Baltimore was my city. So several years later, when I was in Los Angeles and looking to move back to the East Coast, I learned that the Orioles were going to build this ballpark in downtown Baltimore. I knew from Jonathan Barnett's class about how Baltimore had reinvented itself. And I had the experience of having worked at Battery Park City, of development that wanted to be contextual in a city full of great context. And I felt that I could help Larry Lucchino achieve his dream of making a baseball park fit in the city. So I wrote him a letter, and the rest is history, as they say. But it is a reminder that we're all a composite of the experiences we've had and the things we've learned along the way. And I'm a big advocate of sort of taking those things and applying them to different genres. And I didn't really expect the sports thing to stick, but I've loved the ability to work at so many different scales, and in so many different cities on that.
I just think it's great for young planners to hear how your career, what you do allows you to do other things. You're always building on your experience and past.
And learning every day of the week too. There are just so many things out there to look at and think of differently. And I think the sort of wonderful thing about planning is that it does give you a chance to really study the place you're in, the community you're in. It doesn't have to be city with a capital C, but how do you give expression to that? How do you really create something that feels right for that time, that place? And how do you think of it as being elastic enough that it can be a building block for whatever comes in the future?
I have two very quick questions left. The first one is, I think maybe 3 or 4 people have now asked it. So I thought, okay, I have to ask this. Apparently, there may or may not be plans for, when we're talking transportation, a gondola system for the Dodgers Stadium. Can you just very quickly give us
Sure.
an update on where that's at?
I can. A gondola has been proposed to connect an area near Union Station to Dodger Stadium, presumably as a leg of transit. I mentioned earlier how robust a metro system Los Angeles has today. Urge you to ride it if you haven't recently. It's not what it was in the old days. So that is currently sort of working its way, that proposal is working its way through the various environmental reviews that are a part of the tradition of the city of LA. And we are always for any form of transit that connects to others, so eagerly awaiting what
That's really
happens there.
fun. And for those who are like, what's a gondola? It's like the indoor kind of ski lift where it's like a big box that's really exciting. My very last question is probably the most important question of the day, and that is peanuts, popcorn, or hot dogs. Which one? What is the best
Cracker Jacks.
taste?
You didn't say Cracker
Well,
Jacks.
okay, fine. But that's like popcorn and peanuts together, kind of.
I know, I know. Well, I'm a peanut gal myself,
Okay.
even as though I respect the fact that there are days that I go when it's peanut free and I feel like I need to behave. So
Right. What about you, Jim? What's your
we all
go-to?
learn to respect the yes, the atmosphere around us.
Right.
My
Absolutely.
go-to is to find the one food at a ballpark that I haven't seen before.
Oh, interesting.
Is
Yeah, and that's a whole other thing. There are whole restaurants that are in ballparks now that are super trendy.
food is much better at ballparks now
That
than it had
sure
been.
is.
Oh, amen. Yeah, absolutely.
And I know we're at the time,
Yeah,
but Marcel had a question. Do you have a favorite mascot in Major League Baseball? Marcel loves mascots.
that's funny. I didn't know that about him.
That is great. I like that you made it mascots because people often say you have a favorite team or a favorite ballpark, and it's like your children. It's like absolutely not.
Yeah.
But mascots, it might be okay to have a favorite mascot. I don't know. I guess it would be hard not to love the Phillies fanatic. It's one of the first true mascots in the major leagues, and I think still is kind of the gold standard.
Yeah, and I saw a picture of it there in your slides. So, well, Janet Marie, thank you very much for.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I
This
didn't
was
get
a
to
lot
see
of
all the
fun.
other people
Yeah.
on Zoom, but thank you very much.
It's a great summer event, right, Martha?
Right.
Thank you. All right. Well, happy outings. Enjoy the summer.
And thanks to the Urban Design and Preservation Division. Don't forget to log those CM credits. Head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast to get all the information you need for CM credits. And we are recording the session. We'll post it on our YouTube channel. You can get that recording on our website too. And you can register for all of our upcoming sessions there as well. Thanks to everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.